When my mother-in-law mocked the scratches on my dad's wrist, asking if he had bought his watch at a garage sale, the entire auction house erupted in laughter. I squeezed his hand, swallowing my rage, knowing they saw us as nothing but dirt on their designer shoes. But then the auctioneer froze. He stared at that rusted metal, leaned into his microphone, and whispered a question that would cost my husband's family 51% of their empire. My name is Sydney Dunn, and I was standing in the middle of a Shark Tank wearing nothing but a target on my back. The air inside the Caldwell and Sons auction house in Harbor Point, Connecticut, smelled of old mahogany, floor wax, and the kind of aggressive perfume that costs more than my father made in a month. This was the habitat of the coastal elite, a place where people did not merely speak. They declared. They did not walk. They glided. And right now, every pair of surgically enhanced eyes in the room seemed to be boring into the back of my father's cheap suit jacket. I tightened my grip on my father's arm. Earl Dunn was a man built of grease, steel, and silence. He was a retired mechanic who had spent 40 years under the hoods of cars that belonged to people like this, fixing their mistakes so they could drive away and forget he existed. Tonight, he looked small. He was wearing his only suit, a charcoal gray polyester blend that he had bought for my mother's funeral 6 years ago. It was clean, pressed, and completely out of place against the sea of bespoke Italian wool and silk surrounding us. But it was his wrist that drew the eye. Resting against the cuff of his shirt was a watch. It was not a Patek Philippe or a Rolex. It was a heavy, battered piece of metal with a cracked face and a strap that had been replaced 3 times. The steel was scratched so deeply in places that it looked like it had been chewed by a machine. It was ugly. It was old. And to the people in this room, it was an offense. We were walking toward our assigned seats when the first arrow landed. The front row was occupied by the Ashford family, my in-laws. They looked like a royal portrait of American greed. Gregory Ashford, my father-in-law, sat with his legs crossed, checking the time on a gold timepiece that probably cost $50,000. Next to him was Veronica, my mother-in-law, draped in a shawl that looked like spun silver. And then there was Lila, my sister-in-law, the golden child, sitting with her husband Chase. They were glowing with the confidence of people who had never been told no in their entire lives. As Dad and I passed the row behind them, Veronica leaned toward her friend, a woman with hair so blonde it looked white. Veronica did not whisper. She never whispered. She pitched her voice perfectly, a stage whisper designed to carry. "I swear," Veronica said, crinkling her nose as if she had smelled something rotting. "All we are missing is the smell of gasoline and cheap oil. Suddenly this feels less like an estate auction and more like a mobile repair station." The woman next to her giggled, a sharp, brittle sound. The laughter spread down the row like a contagion. Gregory smirked, but did not look back. He never looked back at us. To him, we were background noise, static on his otherwise perfect frequency. My father stiffened. I felt the muscles in his forearm bunch up, hard as iron. He began to pull his hand back, trying to slide the offending watch under his sleeve, to hide the evidence of his working-class life. I stopped him. I did not look at Veronica. I did not give her the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, I guided Dad to our seats, 2 folding chairs set up in the back, far away from the velvet ropes of the VIP section. I sat down and placed my hand over his. His skin was rough, calloused from decades of holding wrenches and turning bolts. "Keep it visible," I said, my voice low and steady. Dad looked at me, his eyes tired. "Sydney, honey, maybe I should just put it in my pocket. I don't want to embarrass you. These people, they notice everything." "Let them notice," I said. "Let them look. We are not here to hide. Dad, we are here to finish something." Dad did not understand. Not fully. He thought we were here because I had insisted he see where my husband's grandmother, Margaret Ashford, had lived. He thought we were here to pay respects. He did not know that the scratched piece of metal on his wrist was not just a watch, it was a bomb, and I was the only one in the room who knew how to light the fuse. A few feet away, Lila shifted in her seat. She held her phone up, the screen glowing bright against the dim lighting of the auction hall. She was live streaming. Of course, Lila lived her life for an audience of strangers. I watched as she angled the phone backward, pretending to capture the architecture of the ceiling, before sharply panning down to where we were sitting. She zoomed in. I could see the screen from where I sat. The lens focused brutally on my father's wrist, on the scratches and the dull metal of his watch. "Oh my God! Guys," Lila said to her phone, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Can you believe people still wear things like this? It looks like something you'd find at a flea market bin for $5. Antique or just trash? You vote." She hit a button, posting the story, and then leaned back against Chase, giggling as the notifications started to roll in. My ears burned. A hot, prickly heat climbed up my neck. I wanted to stand up. I wanted to walk over there and smash that phone into the floor. I wanted to scream at them that the man wearing that watch had more honor in his little finger than their entire bloodline had in a century. But I sat still. "Breathe," I told myself. "Let them despise us. Today, their contempt is necessary. If they respected him, they might be on guard. But because they see him as dirt, they won't see him coming." The lights in the hall dimmed. The murmuring crowd quieted down as a spotlight hit the podium at the front of the room. A man stepped into the light. Mr. Caldwell was a legend in the auction world. He was a man of silver hair and impeccable posture, wearing a suit that fit him like a second skin. He held a gavel made of dark oak, and when he tapped it against the block, the sound was like a gunshot. "Ladies and gentlemen," Caldwell said, his voice a rich baritone that commanded absolute silence. "Welcome to the estate auction of the late Margaret Ashford, a woman of taste, history, and legacy." The Ashfords preened. Gregory adjusted his tie, looking around the room as if taking credit for the air we were breathing. Veronica sat straighter, looking every inch the grieving but glamorous daughter-in-law. They were discussing the items listed in the catalog, loudly enough for everyone to hear. "The landscape painting is the only thing really worth keeping," Gregory said. "The rest is just sentimental clutter. We will buy back the jewelry. Of course. Can't have family heirlooms circulating among the commoners." "I just want the pearls," Lila said, scrolling on her phone. "And maybe that vintage vanity set. It would look cute in the guest house." They were carving up Margaret's life like vultures picking at a carcass. They had no idea what was actually written in the will. They had no idea what Margaret and I had discussed in those long, quiet afternoons in the nursing home while they were too busy attending galas to visit her. The auction began. Items came and went. A set of silver candlesticks sold for $2,000. A Persian rug went for $12,000. The numbers were tossed around casually, meaningless sums to the people in this room. My father watched it all with wide eyes, shrinking a little more with every bid. He looked at his watch again, his thumb rubbing nervously over the scratched crystal face. He started to pull his sleeve down over it again. I reached out and stopped him. I squeezed his wrist, hard enough to leave a mark. "Dad," I whispered, leaning close to his ear. "Do not hide it. You promised me. Wear it. Today. That watch is our weapon. It is the only shield we have." He looked at me, confused by the intensity in my voice, but he nodded. He pushed his sleeve back up. He let the ugly, scratched metal catch the light. An hour passed. The air in the room was getting stifling. Then, Caldwell cleared his throat. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at a small card on the podium. "Lot number 47, Caldwell announced. Described in the catalog as assorted gentlemen's effects, includes one vintage wristwatch, maker unknown, condition, heavily worn." A murmur of amusement rippled through the room. On the large screen behind Caldwell, a photo appeared. It was a picture of a watch that looked almost exactly like my father's, though this one was sitting on a velvet cushion. It looked tired, sad. Veronica let out a short, sharp laugh. "Heavily worn?" she said, loud and clear. "That is generous. It looks like it was run over by a truck. I bet it sells for $20, just enough for tip money for the valet." The room chuckled. It was a cruel sound. a collective sneer from the wealthy directed at something they deemed beneath them. Mr. Caldwell did not laugh. He stood very still behind the podium. He did not start the bidding. Instead, his eyes scanned the room. He looked over the heads of the people in the front row. He looked past the diamonds and the silk. His gaze traveled all the way to the back of the room, to the shadows where the commoners sat. And then he stopped. Mr. Caldwell's eyes locked onto my father. Time seemed to warp. The air in the room grew heavy. Caldwell stared. He blinked, once, twice, as if he could not believe what he was seeing. His gaze dropped from my father's face down to his chest, and then to his wrist. My father froze. He felt the attention, the sudden, terrifying weight of being seen. Caldwell stepped out from behind the podium. This was highly irregular. The auctioneer never left the block. A ripple of confusion went through the crowd. Gregory Ashford frowned, turning in his seat to see what was happening. "Mr. Caldwell?" Gregory asked. "Is there a problem with the lot?" Caldwell ignored him. He walked down the center aisle, his steps deliberate and slow. The crowd parted for him. He walked past the Ashford family without even glancing at them. He kept walking until he stood right in front of us. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. This was it. Caldwell looked at me. There was a flicker of recognition in his eyes, a secret shared between conspirators. Then he looked at my father. He looked at the watch on Earl Dunn's wrist, the watch that Veronica had called a mobile repair station, the watch Lila had called trash. The auctioneer bent down slightly, bringing his face level with my father's. The room was so silent you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Every camera, every eye, every person was focused on us. Caldwell pointed a manicured finger at the scratched, battered watch on my father's arm. "Sir," Caldwell said, his voice low but projected perfectly so that the microphone on his lapel caught every syllable. "Excuse me." He paused, letting the suspense build, letting the Ashfords crane their necks, letting the tension stretch until it was ready to snap. "Do you really want the world to know," Caldwell whispered, his voice echoing through the speakers, "that you are wearing that specific watch?" The silence that followed Mr. Caldwell's question was heavy, but in my mind, the noise was deafening. It transported me instantly from the auction floor back to the very first time I brought my father to the Ashford estate. That memory was 5 years old, but it still tasted like bile in the back of my throat. I remembered the dining room. It was vast, illuminated by a chandelier that probably cost more than the house I grew up in. My father had been so nervous that evening. He had spent an hour ironing his best shirt, a light blue button-down that had started to fray slightly at the collar. He had polished his shoes until they shone. He wanted to make a good impression on the people who raised the man I loved. We were halfway through the appetizer, a cold soup that tasted like garnish and pretension, when Veronica Ashford reached across the table. She did not reach for the salt. She reached for my father's hand. She lifted his wrist as if she were inspecting a piece of produce at a market to see if it was rotting. Her manicured nails tapped against the glass face of his watch. "Is this a Black Friday special?" she asked, her voice bright and loud enough to echo off the vaulted ceiling. Or perhaps a prize from a cereal box? The table erupted. Gregory laughed a deep, belly-shaking sound. Lila covered her mouth with a napkin to hide her giggle. Even the serving staff seemed to pause. My father froze, his face turning a deep, shameful shade of red. He gently pulled his hand back, tucking it under the table, murmuring an apology that he did not owe anyone. I looked at Nolan, my husband. I waited for him to speak up. I waited for him to say that the watch was fine, or at least tell his mother that she was being rude. Instead, Nolan offered a tight, awkward smile. He leaned toward me and whispered the words that would become the soundtrack of our marriage. "Don't be sensitive, Sid," he said, giving my knee a patronizing pat. "Mom is just joking. You know her sense of humor." That was the first crack in the glass. It was the moment I realized that in this house, cruelty was dressed up as wit, and defending your dignity was labeled as being oversensitive. Over the years, The insults became a ritual. Every holiday, every birthday, every gathering was an opportunity for the Ashfords to remind me of where I came from. Veronica loved to rewrite history. She would sit in her parlor with a glass of Chardonnay and lecture me on the genealogy of Harbor Point. "The Ashfords built this town," she would say, gesturing vaguely at the window. "We laid the foundations. We created the commerce. Your people, Sydney. They just turned the screws. They fixed the leaks. Someone has to do it, I suppose. But let us not pretend we are made of the same clay." They saw the grease under my father's fingernails as dirt. I saw it as evidence of survival. And the watch they mocked? They saw garbage. I saw a Medal of Honor. They never asked where he got it. In 5 years, not one Ashford ever asked Earl Dunn why he wore a battered piece of metal that lost 2 minutes every week. If they had asked, they would have learned that the watch was a gift from his old boss, the owner of a textile factory that had stood on the edge of town 40 years ago. One night in 1985, a fire had broken out in the warehouse. The alarms failed. The sprinkler system was dry. My father, just a junior mechanic then, had run back into the burning building 3 times. He did not run in for money. He ran in to pull 2 unconscious security guards out of the smoke. He dragged them to safety while the roof collapsed behind him. The heat was so intense it singed his eyebrows off and melted the rubber soles of his boots. The factory owner had visited him in the hospital. He took that watch off his own wrist, a custom prototype given to him by a European designer, and strapped it onto my father's bandaged arm. He told my dad that time was the most precious thing a man could give, and Earl had given the rest of his life to those guards. But the Ashfords did not care about heroism unless it came with a plaque and a tax deduction. To them, the watch was just ugly. The humiliation reached its peak 2 years ago at a summer cocktail party. The Ashfords were hosting a fundraiser for a cause they could not care less about. Lila was holding court with a group of her friends, young women who had never worked a day in their lives. My father was standing by the buffet table, trying to make himself invisible. Lila walked over to him. She did not say hello. She grabbed his wrist and hoisted it into the air like she was displaying a caught fish. "Look at this," she announced to her circle. "This is exactly why Sydney had to marry my brother. She had to save her bloodline. Imagine if her life ended up with accessories like this." Her friends laughed. It was a cruel, chirping sound. Lila dropped his hand as if it were contaminated. My father just stood there, rubbing his wrist, looking at his shoes. I was standing 10 feet away. I felt a wave of heat rush through my body that was so intense I nearly passed out. I walked over, grabbed my father's arm, and started to pull him toward the door. I wanted to leave. I wanted to burn the house down on my way out. But my father stopped me. Outside on the driveway, under the pale light of the street lamps, I begged him. "Dad, please," I said, my voice shaking. "Just take it off, please. When you come here, just leave it at home. Buy a cheap digital one. Buy anything. I cannot stand watching them treat you like this." Earl Dunn looked at me. He smiled. A soft, sad smile that broke my heart. "Sydney," he said quietly, "I am not ashamed of this watch. It reminds me of who I am. It reminds me that I kept my word to a man who trusted me. It reminds me that I saved lives. If I take it off to please them, then I am agreeing with them. I am agreeing that what I did holds no value. The watch might be cheap now, honey, but the promise I made isn't." He refused to hide, but the Ashfords refused to stop. The mockery evolved into policy. When Nolan and I started planning our wedding, Veronica suggested, no, she demanded, that we pay for my father to stay in a nice assisted living facility for the week of the ceremony. "It will be better for everyone," she had said, sipping her morning coffee. "He will be comfortable. He won't have to worry about mingling with people he does not understand. Plus, it would save us the embarrassment of having him in the photos. We can just tell people he is too frail to attend." I fought them. I screamed until my throat was raw. Nolan stood in the middle, wringing his hands, telling me to compromise. In the end, my father walked me down the aisle, but Veronica ensured the photographer cropped him out of every official family portrait. Every insult was a knife. But knives, I learned, could be collected. I started to change. On the outside, I was still the quiet, obedient daughter-in-law. I nodded at their insults. I smiled when they made jokes about blue-collar workers. I let them think they had broken me. But on the inside, I was building a fortress. I realized that to the Ashford family, my father was a symbol of everything they feared. He was real. He was unpolished. He was the dirt they stood on. And they hated him for it because deep down, they knew that without the dirt, they would have nowhere to stand. And me? I was just the vessel. I was the genetic stock brought in to ensure their grandchildren did not turn out too inbred, a necessary evil to keep the dynasty alive. They thought I was weak because I stayed. They did not understand that I was staying for reconnaissance. I began to look at that watch differently. It was no longer just a sentimental heirloom. It was a key. It was a witness. I swore to myself, sitting in their cold, sterile living room while they laughed at a sitcom that wasn't funny, that one day I would make them choke on their laughter. I swore that the very object they ridiculed, the scratched steel, the faded dial, the ticking heart of my father's dignity, would be the instrument of their undoing. I did not know how, I did not know when, but I knew that the universe had a sense of irony, and I was going to help it deliver the punchline. Standing there in the auction house, with Caldwell's eyes locked on us, I felt the weight of all those years of silence. I felt the ghost of every Black Friday joke, every sneer about gasoline smells, every cropped photo. The Ashfords thought they were untouchable. They thought the past was something you could just edit out like a bad glare in a picture. They were about to learn that the past is not a picture. The past is a debt. And tonight, the bill collector had finally arrived, wearing a polyester suit and a watch that was worth more than their souls. I squeezed my father's hand again. He was trembling slightly. He looked terrified, thinking he had done something wrong, thinking he was about to be thrown out. I leaned in close to him, my lips brushing his ear. "Stand tall, Dad," I whispered. "Do not look down. Look at them. Look them in the eye." Because for the first time in 5 years, the Ashfords were not laughing. The room had gone deadly silent. All the air had been sucked out of the space, leaving only the sound of Mr. Caldwell's breath over the microphone and the terrified, confused beating of Veronica Ashford's heart. I turned my head slowly. I looked at my mother-in-law. Her mouth was slightly open. Her eyes were darting from Caldwell to the watch, and then, finally, to me. She saw it then. For a fraction of a second, the veil lifted. She looked into my eyes and she did not see the submissive daughter-in-law. She saw the hunter who had been waiting in the long grass. She saw the reflection of her own cruelty staring back at her, ready to strike. And I smiled. It was the first honest smile I had given her in half a decade. "Yes, Mr. Caldwell," I said, my voice ringing out clear and sharp, cutting through the silence like a razor blade. "We would love for everyone to know exactly what this watch is." The trap was sprung, the floor was about to drop out from under them, and I was going to enjoy every single second of the fall, to understand why the auctioneer was standing in front of my father, pointing a trembling finger at his wrist. You have to understand the woman whose name was on the auction banner. You have to understand Margaret Ashford. If my husband and his parents were the loud, flashy neon signs of the Ashford Empire, Margaret was the electricity humming quietly in the walls. She was nothing like them. She was 92 years old, frail as a dried leaf, but her eyes were sharp, terrifyingly intelligent, and utterly devoid of the patience she pretended to have for her family. While Gregory and Veronica spent their days attending luncheons and talking about networking, Margaret spent her final years in the Whispering Pines estate, a high-end nursing facility on the edge of town. The family called it a tragedy that they were too busy to visit often. They claimed they were securing the family legacy. I knew the truth. They were just waiting for her to die so the trust funds would unlock. I was the exception. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, I drove to Whispering Pines. I did not go because I wanted an inheritance. I went because, in a family of sharks. Margaret was the only one who didn't look at me like I was bait. I brought her lemon squares from a bakery she used to love before her diet became restricted, and I read to her, but mostly, we talked. Or rather, she interrogated me. It started about 6 months after I married Nolan. I was sitting by her bedside, peeling an orange, when she suddenly reached out and gripped my wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "They have been working on you, haven't they?" she asked. Her voice was raspy but clear. I froze. I asked her what she meant. "The shame," Margaret said. "Have they taught you to be ashamed of where you come from yet? Or do you still remember that your father's hands are the only honest things in your life?" I looked at her, stunned. I had spent months trying to be the perfect Ashford wife, smoothing out my edges, buying the right clothes, learning which fork to use for the salad. I thought I was blending in, but Margaret saw right through the cashmere and the pearls. She saw the mechanic's daughter who was holding her breath, terrified of making a mistake. I put the orange down. I decided to tell her the truth. "I remember," I said quietly. "I will always remember." Margaret nodded. Satisfied. "Good. Don't let them scrub you clean." "Sydney, the grit is the only thing that makes a person interesting." From that day on, our relationship changed. We became conspirators. She stopped pretending to be the sweet, senile grandmother, and I stopped pretending to be the vapid socialite daughter-in-law. We talked about business. We talked about the history of Harbor Point, and inevitably, we talked about the way her son and daughter-in-law treated my family. One afternoon, I arrived early and found the door to her room slightly ajar. Veronica was inside. I stopped in the hallway, unseen. "Mother, you have to understand," Veronica was saying, her voice pitched in that whining tone she used when she wanted money. "We cannot invite the Dunns to the gala. It is about image. Having Earl there, with his off-the-rack suits and his rough manners, it is like having a stain on a silk dress. We are just trying to protect the brand you built." I held my breath, waiting for Margaret to defend us, but she said nothing. She just hummed, a non-committal sound that Veronica took for agreement. When Veronica left, sweeping past me in the hall without even seeing me, I walked into the room. Margaret was looking out the window, her jaw set hard. "You heard that, didn't you?" she asked without turning around. I nodded. She turned to face me. Her eyes were furious. "They call your family a stain," she whispered. "They think they are the silk. They have forgotten that silk tears the moment you snag it on something real. I will not let them tear apart what I built. I will not let my legacy fund their arrogance." A week later, the dynamic shifted from emotional support to professional strategy. Margaret asked me to close the door and pull the blinds. She reached under her mattress and pulled out a thick manila envelope. "I hear things. Sydney," she said, "I have old friends who still sit on boards. I hear that before you married my useless grandson, you were not just a receptionist at a bank." She looked at me expectantly. I took a deep breath. My husband thought I did administrative work for a consultancy firm. It was a half-truth I let him believe because it made him feel superior. "I am a senior forensic accountant for Northbridge Advisory." I told her, "I specialize in asset recovery and fraud investigation. I find money that people try to hide." Margaret smiled. It was a wolfish smile. I knew it. "You have the eyes of a hunter." She pushed the envelope toward me. "This is the current draft of my will," she said. "Along with the financial statements for Ashford Harbor Holdings, Gregory thinks he is clever. He thinks I don't read the reports because my eyesight is failing. He is wrong. I want you to look at these. Tell me what you see." I spent the next 3 hours going through the documents. It was a disaster. The will was standard. It gave everything to Gregory, with trickle-down provisions for Nolan and Lila. It essentially handed the keys to the kingdom to a man who was already leveraging the castle to pay for his gambling debts. But the financial statements were worse. They showed a company that was being hollowed out from the inside. Massive executive bonuses, questionable consulting fees paid to shell companies, and a complete lack of reinvestment in the workforce or infrastructure. When I finished, Margaret asked me the question that changed everything. "If you were me, Sydney, she asked, leaning back against her pillows, would you give it to them? Would you give them the company? I looked at the woman who had started this business 60 years ago with nothing but grit and a loan. I looked at the numbers that proved her son was destroying it. No, I said, if I were you, I wouldn't give them a single cent until they learned how to earn it. And looking at these numbers, I don't think they ever will. Margaret let out a long breath. Good. I do not like people who lie to me to make me feel better. Now, get a pen. We have work to do. Over the next 6 months, we quietly restructured the entire Ashford estate. It was a masterclass in corporate law and estate planning. Margaret hired her own private counsel, bypassing the family lawyers entirely. We created blind trusts. We separated the voting rights from the dividends. We drafted clauses that protected the employees, the pension funds, and the community projects. But the most important part was the control of the company itself. Margaret wanted to ensure that Gregory could not sell the company off for parts. She wanted to anchor the leadership to something, or someone, who understood the value of work. That was when I brought in my father's watch. It was a Tuesday. I had mentioned the watch to Margaret before, telling her the story of the fire and the factory owner. She had asked to see it. I borrowed it from my dad that morning, telling him I wanted to get the clasp tightened. Margaret held the watch in her hands for a long time. She ran her thumb over the deep scratches on the bezel. She traced the faded numbers on the dial. My husband had a watch like this, she murmured. Not this brand, but this condition. He wore it while he built the first dock at the harbor. He never polished it. He said the scratches were his resume. She looked up at me. I trust a man who wears a watch like this, Sydney. I trust him more than I trust a man who wears gold that he has never sweat in. She then told me a secret. It was a story about the early days of the company, about a time when the Ashford business almost went under. She told me about a handshake deal, a contract made between her husband and a group of workers who agreed to forego their wages for 3 months to keep the company afloat. One of those workers was a man named Thomas Dunn, my grandfather. I sat there, stunned. I had never known. My father had never known. The Ashfords certainly didn't know, or if they did, they had buried the history deep underground. That contract was never formalized in the modern books. Margaret said, but I have the original copy, and I have the moral obligation. The Ashfords owe the Dunns, not just money, but their very existence. We added a final, devastating clause to the new will. It was a dormant clause, triggered only by specific behavior. It was designed to test the character of her heirs. If they showed respect, they would inherit a portion. If they showed contempt, specifically toward the family that had helped save them, they would lose everything. 2 weeks before she died, Margaret called Mr. Caldwell to her room. Caldwell was an old flame of hers, decades ago, before life took them in different directions. He was the only auctioneer she trusted. I sat in the corner while she gave him his instructions. She handed him the sealed appendix to her will. She handed him the details of the watch. When the time comes, Arthur, she told him, her voice weak but commanding, you will know what to do. You will hold the auction. You will wait for the item, and you will watch them. If they mock it, if they laugh, then you open this envelope. Caldwell had looked at me, then at the watch, then back at Margaret. He understood. You are playing a dangerous game. Margaret, he had said. I am not playing, she replied. I am cleaning house. Flash forward to the auction room. The air was still vibrating with the silence that followed Caldwell's whisper. I looked at the man on the podium. He wasn't just an auctioneer anymore. He was the executor of a dead woman's final judgment. He looked at my father, waiting for an answer to his question. Do you really want the world to know that you are wearing that specific watch? I squeezed Dad's hand. He looked at me, bewildered, terrified that he had committed a social sin. He didn't know that he was the centerpiece of the plan. He didn't know that Margaret had seen him, really seen him, through my stories and through the history written in the scratches on his wrist. I stood up. My legs felt steady. The fear was gone, replaced by the cold, hard certainty of numbers and facts. "Yes," I said, my voice carrying to the back of the room where the Ashfords sat frozen. "We want everyone to know." Caldwell nodded. He reached under the podium and pulled out a document with a red wax seal. The room gasped. It was the seal of Margaret Ashford's private legal counsel. "Then let us proceed," Caldwell said, not with a bid, but with a reading. The earth on Margaret Ashford's grave had not even settled before the vultures began to circle the carcass of her estate. The funeral had been a somber, tasteful affair, exactly the kind of event Veronica loved to host because it allowed her to wear black silk and dab at dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. But the moment the black limousines deposited us back at the main Ashford villa, the masks came off. We gathered in the mahogany-paneled boardroom that Gregory insisted on having in his private residence. It was less a family grieving together and more a board meeting of hostile shareholders. Gregory walked straight to the wet bar and uncorked a bottle of Cabernet that cost more than $3,000. The pop of the cork echoed in the silent room like a gunshot. "To new beginnings," Gregory said, raising his glass. He did not toast his mother. He toasted the opportunity she had left behind. He did not waste time. He paced the length of the Persian rug, his voice booming with the confidence of a man who believed he had just won the lottery. "Obviously, the restructuring will be swift," Gregory announced, pouring a second glass for himself. "I will absorb the chairman role and take full control of the voting shares. That is a given. Nolan, you and Sydney will officially take title to the Harbor Point guest estate, though I will need to keep the deed in the trust for tax purposes." He turned to his daughter, who was already browsing vacation spots on her tablet. "Lila, you and Chase get the yacht and the liquid cash from the bond maturity next month. That should cover your little renovation projects." Then, for the first time in 20 minutes, he looked at me. His gaze was dismissive, like he was looking at a piece of furniture that clashed with the decor. "And Sydney," he said, waving a hand vaguely, "there are some minor watercolors in the attic, some landscapes. Feel free to pick a few, if you like that sort of thing." I sat there, hands folded in my lap, feeling the temperature in the room drop 20 degrees. They were carving up Margaret's life before the flowers on her casket had even wilted. Veronica, however, had other concerns. She turned to me, her eyes narrowing. "Speaking of the estate," she said sharply, "the auction is coming up. I want to make one thing very clear regarding your father." I stiffened. I felt Nolan shift uncomfortably beside me, but he said nothing. "We are inviting significant investors," Veronica continued. "People who matter. I do not want Earl wandering around telling stories about grease fires and carburetors. Make sure he wears something that does not look like he bought it at a thrift store. And for heaven's sake, tell him not to touch the heritage items. We do not need his fingerprints on the silver." I looked at Nolan. I looked right at him, waiting. This was his moment. This was the moment a husband is supposed to say, "That is enough, Mother." But Nolan just swirled his wine, staring intently at the crimson liquid. I stood up. I walked out of the room, my heels clicking loudly on the hardwood. I went to the terrace, needing air that didn't smell of old money and fresh betrayal. Nolan followed me a minute later. "You are being dramatic," he said, leaning against the stone railing. "Dramatic?" I asked, my voice trembling with suppressed rage. "She just treated my father like a stray dog she is afraid will pee on the rug. And you said nothing." Nolan sighed, rubbing his temples. "Look, Sydney, Mom is stressed. The transition of power is complicated. Don't make this hard for me. Everything has already been decided. Just play your part, and we all walk away with what we want." I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized that the man I thought I married did not exist. I had married a mirror. He only reflected whoever was standing in front of him, and right now, he was reflecting Gregory and Veronica. He chose his tribe. I was about to tell him I was leaving. I was about to pack my bags and walk away from the toxicity, but then, I heard a voice drifting from the open patio doors below. It was Lila. She was on the phone, laughing. "Oh, absolutely," Lila was saying. "I am going to purge everything. The moment the auction is over, I am selling whatever is left. Grandma had boxes of junk in her safe. Old letters, some rusty watches, sentimental trash. I will probably toss them in a bulk lot or melt them down if there is any gold content. Who cares? Cash is cash. I froze. A rusty watch. If I left now, if I filed for divorce and walked away, I would lose access. I would lose the ability to be in the room. And if I wasn't in the room, Lila would get her hands on the inventory. She would find the watch, the twin to my father's, the key to the entire fail-safe Margaret had built, and she would sell it or destroy it without ever knowing what it meant. I realized then that I could not leave. Not yet. I had to stay. I had to endure the suffocation of this marriage a little longer, not for love, but for war. I went back inside, washed my face, and put my mask back on. The breaking point, however, came 3 nights later at dinner. The atmosphere was tense. Veronica had been drinking since noon. She was picking at her salad, her eyes glassy and mean. She started talking about bloodlines again, about how the Ashford name was a brand that needed protecting from dilution. "You know," she said, pointing her fork at me, "we really did you a favor. Sydney, marrying into this family was the best thing that ever happened to the Dunn lineage. Your father should be paying us a dowry for taking you off his hands. God knows he could not afford to feed you properly on a mechanic's pension." The insult was so casual, so vile, that I snapped. "My father," I said, my voice steady, "fed me with money he earned by working. Veronica, he didn't inherit a dime. He built his life with his hands. That is worth more than any trust fund sitting at this table." The room went silent. Gregory stopped chewing. Veronica stared at me, her face turning a blotchy red. She stood up, grabbed her wineglass, and smashed it against the wall behind me. Shards of crystal rained down on the floor. Red wine splattered like blood against the silk wallpaper. "You ungrateful little stray," she hissed, "if you do not know how to be thankful. This family will teach you what debt looks like. You are an investment. Sydney, and right now, you are failing to yield a return." I looked at Nolan. He was wiping a spot of wine off his sleeve. He did not look at me. He did not look at his mother. He simply signaled the maid to come and clean up the mess. That was the night the last thread of affection I held for my husband snapped. I realized I was not a partner in this marriage. I was an acquisition. And my father was just a stain they were trying to bleach out. But they had made a mistake. They had forgotten what I did for a living. They thought I was just a girl who was good with numbers. They didn't know that my job at Northbridge Advisory was to hunt down financial predators. They didn't know that I spent my days analyzing patterns of fraud, money laundering, and asset stripping. If I was going to be an enemy in their house, I would be a silent one. The next morning, I walked into Gregory's home office with a tray of coffee and a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "Gregory," I said softly, "I know you are overwhelmed with the restructuring paperwork. The lawyers charge $500 an hour just to organize files. Why don't I help? I can sort the documents, scan the contracts, and get everything ready for the audit. It would save the company thousands." Gregory looked up, surprised. He saw a submissive daughter-in-law trying to make amends. He saw free labor. "Fine," he grunted, gesturing to a stack of boxes in the corner. "Just don't mess up the filing system. And deal with Lila's credit card statements, too. She is a nightmare with receipts." I nodded. "Thank you. Gregory, I just want to help." For the next 2 weeks, I lived a double life. By day, I was the helpful Sydney, organizing files and making photocopies. By night, I was a forensic auditor dissecting the carcass of the Ashford Empire. I scanned everything: bank statements, loan agreements, tax returns, email correspondence. I uploaded it all to a secure, encrypted server that only I could access. As I began to follow the money, a cold pit formed in my stomach. I had expected incompetence. I had expected greed. But I did not expect this. The Ashford Empire was a lie. The company was bleeding cash. To cover the losses, Gregory had taken out massive high-interest loans from private lenders. using the family estates as collateral. The Harbor Point house, the one Nolan and I were supposed to own, had been leveraged 3 times over. It was practically owned by the bank. But it got worse. I found a series of transfers to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, labeled under a consulting firm that didn't exist. The money was being siphoned out of the employee pension fund. Gregory and Chase had set up a dummy corporation to drain the retirement savings of their workers to pay for their own lifestyle. It was a Ponzi scheme. They were paying old investors with new money, robbing their employees to buy yachts and vintage wine. I sat in the dim light of the office, staring at a spreadsheet that proved Gregory Ashford was not just a bad businessman, he was a criminal. The insults about my father's watch, about his poverty, about his smell, it was all projection. They mocked us for being poor, but they were the ones who were destitute. They were morally bankrupt and financially hollow. I closed the file and leaned back in the expensive leather chair. I looked at the family portrait hanging on the wall. They looked so regal, so untouchable. I saved the final document. I made a backup copy. They wanted to talk about worth. They wanted to talk about value. I checked the date. The auction was in 3 days. I would let them have their big night. I would let them walk into that auction house feeling like kings and queens, and then, when the time was right, I would introduce them to the reality I had just discovered. The truth was going to hurt far more than any broken wine glass. The heavy double doors of the auction house swung open, and the noise inside hit us like a physical wave. It was a cacophony of low-pitched gossip, the clinking of crystal flutes, and the rapid-fire clicking of camera shutters. The room smelled of expensive leather and the kind of aggressive floral perfume that lingers in an elevator long after the wearer has left. I walked in with my father, Earl, by my side. The contrast was immediate and painful. Around us, men in bespoke tuxedos and women in gowns that cost more than a mid-sized sedan were gliding across the plush carpet. My father was wearing his charcoal suit, the one he saved for church and funerals. It was clean and pressed, but the fabric was stiff, and the cut was boxy, a relic from a department store sale 10 years ago. The receptionist, a young woman with a headset and a clipboard, looked up as we approached. Her professional smile faltered for a fraction of a second as her eyes scanned my father's scuffed shoes and his calloused hands. She glanced down at her list, then back up, her lips parting to ask if we were in the right place. But before she could speak, Mr. Caldwell appeared at the top of the short staircase leading to the main floor. He did not wave. He simply locked eyes with the receptionist and gave a sharp, imperceptible nod. It was a command. Let them pass. The receptionist swallowed her question and stepped aside, gesturing for us to enter. We had barely taken 3 steps into the main hall when the first strike landed. Veronica was holding court near the center aisle, surrounded by a group of women who all shared the same plastic surgeon. She spotted us immediately. She leaned in toward her neighbor, a woman wearing a diamond necklace thick enough to choke a horse, and spoke in a voice that was designed to carry. "Look at that," Veronica said, swirling her champagne. "My daughter-in-law is such a martyr. She dragged the entire garage with her to a black tie event. I half expect him to start checking the oil levels on the catering carts." The circle of women erupted in laughter. It was a sharp, tinkling sound, like glass breaking. My father flinched. He kept his head down, his hands clasped in front of him, trying to make himself smaller. I felt the heat rising in my cheeks, but I kept my chin up. I needed them to laugh. I needed every person in this room to witness exactly who the Ashfords were. I guided my father to our seats in the back. As we passed the family row, I glanced at my husband. Nolan was not laughing. He was sitting on the edge of his velvet chair, staring at his phone. His face was pale, glistening with a sheen of sweat that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. He was typing furiously, his thumbs blurring over the screen. He didn't look up when I walked by. He didn't acknowledge his wife or his father-in-law. I knew what he was looking at. He was looking at the margin calls on the secret investment accounts I had uncovered days ago. He was looking at threatening texts from lenders who were starting to realize that the Ashford collateral was hollow. He was drowning, and he was too terrified to scream. Next to him, Lila was living in a completely different reality. She had her phone mounted on a small tripod she had set up on the armrest. She was broadcasting live to her followers. "Hey guys," Lila chirped, flashing a bright, practiced smile at the screen. "We are just getting started here. I am thinking of bidding on some of the smaller items just for fun. You know, maybe pick up a vintage vase for the guest bathroom in the new Florida house. It is all just dusty old stuff, but it makes for good content." She treated her grandmother's legacy like a garage sale. To her, these objects were not memories. They were props for her digital vanity. The auction began in earnest. Mr. Caldwell took the podium, commanding the room with the ease of a conductor. He moved through the lots efficiently, a landscape painting, a set of silver cutlery, a diamond brooch. The Ashfords bid on nothing. They sat there, looking bored, waiting for the few high-value items they intended to buy back to save face, unaware that their credit lines were already freezing in the banking systems I had alerted through my report. Then came the moment. Mr. Caldwell cleared his throat. The room quieted down. He gestured to an assistant, who brought out a velvet tray. On it sat a single wristwatch. It was identical to the one on my father's wrist. The crowd squinted. It was an odd item to be auctioning. It was scratched, the metal dull and gray. It looked like junk compared to the diamonds that had come before it. Lila looked up from her phone. She let out a loud, incredulous snort. "Oh my God," Lila said, her voice cutting through the silence. "Put that in a bundle with some old magazines. Who is going to bid on that? Actually, wait." She turned around in her seat, twisting her body to look directly at us in the back row. She pointed her phone at my father. "Hey, Earl," Lila shouted across the room. "You should bid on it. It matches the one you are wearing. You could have a matching set, one for each wrist." Gregory chuckled, a low rumble of a sound. If Mr. Dunn wants it, he should bid. Who knows? Maybe he will win. Then he and Sydney can wear matching market-grade watches. It would be poetic. The entire VIP section laughed. They turned in their seats to look at the mechanic in the cheap suit. They smiled with the cruelty of teenagers in a high school cafeteria. My father looked at the watch on the tray, and then he looked at the watch on his own wrist. His hands were trembling. He wasn't trembling from shame, though they thought he was. He was trembling because he recognized the watch on the stage. He knew what it meant. He remembered the man who had worn it, the man he had saved from a fire, the man who had made a promise to him 40 years ago. He clutched his own wrist, holding onto the metal as if it were a lifeline. "Dad," I whispered, leaning close to him. "Don't look away. Let them see you." I stood up. I did not speak. I just stood there, my hand on my father's shoulder, staring back at the sea of mocking faces. I wanted them to remember this. I wanted the image of their laughter to be burned into the minds of every witness in this room. Mr. Caldwell did not laugh. He stood frozen on the podium. He looked down at the watch on the tray. Then he looked up at the laughing family in the front row. His expression hardened. He looked like a judge who had just heard a confession. He picked up the watch. He didn't hold it by the strap like a piece of trash. He cupped it in his palm with reverence. The laughter died down slowly as people realized the auctioneer was not moving. The silence stretched out, becoming uncomfortable. Mr. Caldwell looked past the lights, past the cameras, past the Ashfords. He looked directly at me. He nodded, a single solemn motion. Then, into the microphone, he spoke. "Ms. Dunn," Caldwell said, his voice echoing in the rafters. "Would you please approach the podium?" A ripple of confusion went through the crowd. This was not protocol. Veronica frowned, looking from Caldwell to me. "Why is he calling her?" Veronica hissed to Gregory. "Is she going to clean the display case?" I ignored her. I squeezed my father's shoulder one last time. "Wait here." "Dad," I said. I walked down the center aisle. The sound of my heels on the hardwood floor was the only noise in the room. I walked with my back straight, my head high. I could feel the eyes of the Ashfords on me. Confused, annoyed, dismissive. They still didn't get it. They thought I was being summoned for a scolding or a chore. I reached the front of the room. I walked up the 3 steps to the raised platform where Caldwell stood. I was now standing higher than Gregory, higher than Veronica. I was looking down at them. Caldwell turned off the main microphone for a brief second, creating a bubble of privacy just for the 2 of us. He leaned down, his face close to mine. His eyes were kind, but sad. He looked at the Ashfords, who were now whispering angrily among themselves. She told me to wait. Caldwell whispered to me. Margaret told me to wait and see. She said, "Arthur, if they treat him with respect, we burn the second envelope, but if they laugh, if they are still laughing when the watch comes out, then we do exactly as it is written in the papers." He looked at me, searching for confirmation. "Are you sure, Sydney?" he asked. "Once we do this, there is no going back. This destroys them." I looked down at the front row. I saw Veronica rolling her eyes. I saw Lila checking her makeup in her phone camera, bored. I saw Gregory signaling for a waiter to bring him another drink. I saw Nolan, still staring at his phone, oblivious to the fact that his wife was standing on a precipice. They had not learned. They would never learn. They were rot. And you cannot cure rot. You have to cut it out. I looked back at Caldwell. "Let us begin," I said. Caldwell nodded. He reached for the switch on the microphone. He turned it back on. The feedback whine cut through the room, silencing the whispers. He placed the watch back on the velvet tray. He did not ask for an opening bid. Instead, he reached under the podium and pulled out a thick envelope sealed with red wax. The room went deadly quiet. "Ladies and gentlemen," Caldwell announced, his voice booming, "there has been a change to the program." He looked directly at Gregory Ashford. "We are not selling this item. We are delivering it. Mr. Caldwell brought the gavel down against the sounding block. It did not sound like a sale. It sounded like a judge slamming a cell door shut. The echo hung in the room, vibrating against the crystal chandeliers. Caldwell did not look at the bidders. He did not look at the cameras. He kept his eyes fixed on the item in front of him. "This item," Caldwell said, his voice stripping away the casual dismissal the Ashfords had just heaped upon it, "is catalogued as Lot 47. However, that is a clerical simplification. This is, in fact, the Veracity prototype. It is the only existing sample created by the master horologist Elias Thorne in 1946. It was commissioned not for retail, but as a ceremonial seal for a contract." A ripple of murmurs went through the crowd. The journalists in the back row stopped typing and started recording. The narrative had shifted instantly. What was trash seconds ago was now a historical artifact. Veronica Ashford straightened in her seat. The boredom vanished from her face, replaced instantly by the predatory sharpness of greed. She leaned forward, her bracelets clinking. "Well," Veronica called out, her voice shrill, "if it is a prototype, what is the valuation? Are we talking 6 figures? 7? I watched her from the podium. Even now, standing on the edge of the abyss, all she could see was the price tag. She did not hear the history. She did not hear the warning. She only heard the cha-ching of a cash register. Caldwell ignored her. He did not answer. Instead, he picked up the red-sealed envelope that had been resting under the podium. He broke the wax seal with a deliberate, snapping sound that was amplified by the microphone. He pulled out a document on thick, cream-colored legal paper. "The value," Caldwell said, his eyes scanning the document, "is irrelevant to the highest bidder, Mrs. Ashford, because this item is not for sale." "Excuse me?" Gregory stood up, his face flushing. "This is an auction. Everything is for sale. That is why we are here." "Not everything," Caldwell corrected him cold and fast. "Please sit down. Mr. Ashford, I am reading from the codicil to the last will and testament of Margaret Ashford. This section is titled The Clause of Character." Gregory sat down slowly, confusion warring with anger on his face. Caldwell began to read. "I, Margaret Ashford, hereby stipulate that the possession of the Thorne prototype watch and the foundational assets attached to its lineage is conditional. This watch represents the dignity of labor. It represents the hands that built the fortune my family now enjoys. Therefore, ownership of this asset is expressly forbidden to pass to any member of the Ashford bloodline who has, by word or deed, mocked, ridiculed, or attempted to shame the owner of its twin. Caldwell paused. He looked up from the paper. "The document continues," he said. "If at any public event, the presence of the twin watch, currently owned by the descendants of the original mechanic, is met with derision or insult by my heirs, then the inheritance clause is immediately voided." The room was deadly silent. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning. "But surely," Gregory stammered, his confidence cracking, "that is subjective. Who is to say what constitutes mockery? A little joke? A misunderstanding? You cannot base a legal transfer on a joke." Caldwell reached under the podium again. He pulled out a small remote control and pointed it at the audio system. "Margaret anticipated your confusion, Gregory," Caldwell said. "She was a woman of evidence." He pressed a button. The speakers crackled for a second, and then a voice filled the room. It was crystal clear. It was the voice of Veronica Ashford, recorded at a cocktail party 3 months ago. "I swear, the man smells like an oil change. It is embarrassing. And that watch? It looks like he dug it out of a trash can. We really need to keep the mechanic out of the photos. It ruins the aesthetic." Then, another voice, Lila's voice. "It is total garbage. Seriously, why does Sydney let him wear it? It is like a rusted shackle. Just buy him a cheap digital one and throw that piece of junk in the river." The recording ended. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Veronica was pale, her mouth opening and closing like a fish on dry land. Lila had lowered her phone, her live stream forgotten, her face a mask of horror. Every person in the room, the investors, the friends, the rivals, had heard it. The cruelty was undeniable. The disdain was public record. Caldwell placed the remote down. "The condition has been triggered," he stated, his voice flat and final. "The mockery was public. The intent was malicious. Therefore, under the terms of the clause of character, the asset transfers immediately." He turned the page of the document. "But the watch is merely the symbol," Caldwell continued. "The foundational assets attached to its lineage refers to the original 1952 operating agreement between Ashford Harbor and its primary labor force. That agreement states that in the event of a breach of faith between management and the founding labor representative, the controlling equity reverts to the representative's family to ensure the protection of the company's integrity." Caldwell looked directly at the camera at the back of the room. "This asset package includes the watch. It also includes 51% of the voting shares of Ashford Harbor Holdings." A gasp went through the room, a collective intake of breath that sucked the oxygen right out of the hall. 51%. It was a hostile takeover from the grave. It was a coup d'etat orchestrated by a grandmother who loved her company more than she tolerated her son's arrogance. "This is insane," Gregory shouted, jumping to his feet again. "That contract is ancient. It is 50 years old. It is unenforceable." "It was recertified," Caldwell replied calmly, 6 months ago, by Margaret Ashford, and it was filed with the state court. It is ironclad." Caldwell turned his body toward me. He gestured to the floor where I stood on the raised platform. "The question remains," Caldwell announced. "Who is the heir to the labor representative? Who is the descendant of Thomas Dunn, the man who signed the original labor accord?" I stepped forward. I reached into my clutch and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I handed it to Caldwell. "My name is Sydney Dunn," I said into the microphone. My voice did not shake. "Thomas Dunn was my grandfather. Earl Dunn, sitting in the back row, is his son. I am his only grandchild. I am the legal representative for the Dunn estate." Caldwell took the paper. He glanced at it, verified the seal, and nodded. "The lineage is confirmed," he declared. He looked out at the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, effective immediately, the controlling interest of Ashford Harbor Holdings is transferred to Ms. Sydney Dunn, The Ashford family retains minority shareholder status only, with no voting rights on the board of directors. The gavel came down. Bang. It was over. In the span of 5 minutes, the Ashford dynasty had been decapitated. For a second, nobody moved. Then, chaos broke. Veronica let out a scream that sounded more animal than human. She launched herself out of her chair. She scrambled up the steps to the podium, her expensive heels slipping on the polished wood. "You witch!" she screamed, her face twisted into a mask of pure hatred. "You planned this. You stole this. That is my money. That is my company." She reached for the microphone, trying to tear it off the stand, trying to silence the truth that had just been spoken. "It is a scam!" she shrieked to the audience, pointing a shaking finger at me. "She is a fraud. She is a nobody. She is just a mechanic's daughter." 2 large security guards in black suits materialized from the shadows. They did not run, but they moved with efficient speed. One of them intercepted Veronica before she could reach me. He grabbed her arm, firmly, professionally. "Ma'am," the guard said, his voice low, "you need to step down." "Get your hands off me," Veronica thrashed, her shawl slipping off her shoulders. "Do you know who I am? I am Mrs. Gregory Ashford. I own this building." "Not anymore, ma'am," the guard said. He guided her, dragged her, really, back down the stairs. The audience watched in stunned silence. The Grand Dame of Harbor Point was being escorted away like a drunk patron at a dive bar. Gregory stood frozen at his seat. He looked at his wife being restrained. He looked at me. His face was gray. He understood what Veronica did not. He understood that screaming would not fix this. He understood that the loophole he had screamed about was actually a noose, and he had just put his head in it. Lila was crying, not silent, pretty tears, ugly, heaving sobs. She was looking at her phone, realizing that she had just broadcast her family's destruction to 12,000 live viewers. I stood on the podium next to Caldwell. I felt a strange sense of calm. The adrenaline that had been coursing through my veins had settled into a cold, hard resolve. I looked down at them. I looked at the people who had made me feel small for 5 years. I looked at the people who had tried to erase my father. I leaned into the microphone one last time. "You can call your lawyers," I said, my voice echoing through the hall. "In fact, I encourage it, but the paperwork is flawless. Margaret made sure of that." I paused, letting my eyes travel from Gregory to Nolan. My husband was still sitting there, his head in his hands, unable to look at me. "But do not leave yet," I said, "because the transfer of ownership is just the administrative part." That was Margaret's lesson. "Now, we are going to move to the second part of the evening." I signaled to the back of the room. "Mr. Caldwell mentioned the clause of character, but there is another clause, the clause of competence, and I think the shareholders in this room deserve to know why the company they invested in is currently empty." I picked up the black leather briefcase I had placed behind the podium earlier. I set it on the table with a heavy thud. "That was the legal judgment," I told them. "Now comes the forensic one. I invite the family to join me in the private viewing room. We have some accounts to reconcile." I walked off the stage. I did not look back at Veronica, who was still arguing with the guard. I walked straight toward the private doors at the back. I passed my father. He was looking at me with awe, clutching his watch. "It is okay, Dad," I whispered as I passed him. "Just watch." The legal thriller was over. The autopsy was about to begin. The transition from the chaotic noise of the auction floor to the VIP viewing room was jarring. The room was soundproofed, lined with acoustic panels and dark wood, creating a vacuum of silence that felt heavier than the screaming we had just left behind. "Mr. Caldwell held the door open. Gregory, Veronica, Lila, Chase, and Nolan filed in. They looked like survivors of a shipwreck who had just washed up on a jagged shore, disheveled, pale, and trembling with a mixture of rage and terror. My father waited outside in the lobby with the security team. As I had requested, this part was not for him. This was a surgery, and it was going to get bloody. I entered last. carrying the black leather briefcase I had prepared 3 days ago. It was heavy, not because of the paper weight, but because of the lives it was about to dismantle. In the center of the room was a long, oval conference table made of polished walnut. Old habits die hard. Gregory Ashford walked straight to the head of the table, the chair with the highest back, the seat of authority he had occupied for 30 years. He reached for the chair back, his knuckles white. "Mr. Ashford?" A quiet voice cut through the tension. It was Mr. Sterling, the bank's lead counsel, who had been waiting in the room with the other legal representatives. He did not look up from his files. "I believe you are mistaken," Sterling said, his tone devoid of emotion. "Legally, the chair of the board sits there. Since the certification of the codicil 5 minutes ago, that seat belongs to Ms. Dunn." Gregory froze. He looked at the chair, then at me. For a moment, I thought he might swing at me, but the fight had drained out of him. He slumped his shoulders and dragged himself to a side chair, sitting down next to a shell-shocked Veronica. I walked to the head of the table. I did not sit immediately. I placed the black briefcase on the polished wood. The click of the latches opening sounded like the cocking of a pistol. I sat down. "This is not a negotiation," I began, my voice steady and low. "We are not here to discuss family feelings. We are here to perform an autopsy on the finances of Ashford Harbor Holdings." I pulled out the first stack of documents. They were color-coded in red. "For years," I said, sliding the papers toward Gregory, "you have projected the image of a titan. You told the board that liquidity was high. You told the public that the Harbor Point expansion was fully funded by profits." I pointed to a highlighted column on the top sheet. "The truth is that the company has been insolvent for 14 months. You have been operating on a float, using short-term, high-interest loans to cover payroll. You are paying 18% interest to private lenders because the major banks stopped lending to you 2 years ago. The company is not an empire, Gregory. It is a corpse that you have been painting with makeup to look alive." Veronica blinked, turning her head slowly to look at her husband. "Gregory?" she whispered. "What is she talking about? The dividends, the quarterly payouts." "Paid from the loans," I answered for him. "He borrowed money to pay you, Veronica, so you wouldn't ask questions." I pulled out the second file. This one was blue. I slid it specifically toward Veronica. "And speaking of questions you didn't ask," I continued, "you believe you own the Harbor Point Villa. You believe you own the summer estate in the Hamptons. You believe you own the yacht." Veronica reached for the papers. Her hands shook so badly she could barely hold the page. "These are mortgage deeds," I explained, keeping my tone clinical. "Second and third liens. Gregory leveraged every single piece of real estate the family holds personally to secure those business loans. The bank owns your house, Veronica. The bank owns your car. If the company declares bankruptcy, which it is on track to do in 6 weeks, the bank will foreclose on everything. You will be homeless." Veronica let out a small, strangled sound. She dropped the paper as if it burned her. She looked at Gregory with horror, but he refused to meet her eyes. He was staring at the table, his jaw clenched. I turned my attention to my husband. Nolan was sitting across from me. He looked nauseous. He knew what was coming. "Nolan," I said softly. He flinched. I slid a single, thin file toward him. It contained printouts of emails. "You knew," I said. "You aren't the architect, but you are the enabler. Here are 3 emails from the compliance officer sent to your private account 6 months ago. They warned you that the internal investment fund was violating federal securities laws. They warned you that commingling client funds with operational cash was a felony." I tapped the paper. "You didn't reply. You didn't report it. You deleted them. You thought that by deleting the emails, you were deleting the problem. You chose to protect your father's lie instead of protecting the clients. That makes you an accessory." Nolan put his head in his hands. "I was trying to keep the peace," he mumbled into his palms. "I didn't want to blow up the family." "You didn't blow up the family," I said. "You just handed me the detonator." Next, I looked at Lila. She was hugging herself, looking small and terrified. Chase, her husband, was trying to distance himself from her physically, inching his chair away. "And the influencer," I said. I pulled out a thick binder. It was 3 inches thick. "This is the expense report for the Marketing and Outreach Department, which you head, Lila. Interestingly, for a shipping and logistics holding company, our marketing budget seems to be heavily focused on luxury travel and handbags." I opened the binder to a bookmarked page. $42,000 for a networking retreat in Tulum. I read, "There were no clients there, just you and your sorority sisters. $12,000 for uniform prototypes that were actually 3 Chanel bags purchased in Paris. Another $15,000 for a pop-up event that was actually your husband's birthday party." Lila's face turned crimson. "I am the face of the brand," she snapped, though her voice wavered. "I have to look the part. It is building social capital." "It is embezzlement," I corrected her. "Corporate funds used for personal enrichment without board approval is theft, Lila. And since you used the corporate credit card across state lines, it is federal wire fraud." Chase jumped in, his voice high and panicked. "I didn't sign off on those. I told her to be careful." "No," I said, pulling out another sheet. "You didn't sign off on the bags. Chase, you were too busy signing off on the Alpha Fund." This was the final file, the black file. I placed it in the center of the table. "The Alpha Fund," I said, "a private investment vehicle open only to employees with more than 10 years of tenure. You promised them a guaranteed 12% return. You took their pension lump sums. You took their savings." I looked at Gregory and Chase. "There are no investments in the Alpha Fund. The money goes into the operating account to pay the interest on Gregory's loans and to pay the dividends to Veronica. You are taking money from your forklift drivers and your secretaries to pay for your country club memberships. It is a Ponzi scheme, plain and simple." The silence in the room was absolute. It was the silence of a tomb. Gregory slammed his hand on the table. He stood up, his face purple with rage. "You traitor!" he shouted, spit flying from his mouth. "You ungrateful, spying little snake! We took you in. We gave you a life. And this is how you repay us? By digging through my trash? By twisting numbers?" He pointed a shaking finger at my face. "You don't understand how business works. You are just a glorified bookkeeper. You have no idea the pressure I am under to keep this family afloat." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I waited for him to finish. "Sit down, Gregory," I said. He remained standing, breathing heavily. "I am not a bookkeeper," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "And I am not just a daughter-in-law you can bully." I reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out my business card. I slid it across the table. It spun slowly and stopped right in front of him. "Sidney Dunn, Senior Forensic Auditor, Northbridge Advisory. For the last 18 months, I said, while you were making jokes about my father's clothes, while you were telling me I didn't belong in your world, I was already there. I work for the firm that the bank hired to investigate your irregularities. I didn't just stumble upon these files. Gregory, I have been building this case since last Christmas." Gregory stared at the card. His eyes went wide. "You," he whispered. "You were the mole?" "I was the auditor," I said. "I did my job. I followed the money. And every time you laughed at my dad, every time you called us trash, you made me dig a little deeper. You made me check one more account. You made me verify one more transaction." I leaned forward. "You called my father's watch garbage, but that watch represents honest work. This table, this room, your suits, this is the garbage. It is all stolen." Gregory collapsed back into his chair. He looked old, defeated. "So what now?" Nolan asked, his voice cracking. "Are you going to blackmail us? Is that it? You want money to keep this quiet?" I looked at my husband with genuine pity. "You still don't get it," I said. "I don't want your money. The company is bankrupt. There is no money to take." I started to put the files back into the briefcase. "I told you, Nolan, I am not here to negotiate. I am here to deliver the findings." At that exact moment, there was a sharp, authoritative knock on the heavy wooden door. Everyone jumped. Veronica let out a whimper. The door opened. 2 men and a woman walked in. They were not wearing tuxedos. They were wearing navy blue windbreakers with yellow lettering on the chest. Connecticut Department of Financial Regulation, Criminal Investigation Division. The lead officer, a tall man with a grim face, stepped forward. He looked at me and nodded. "Ms. Dunn," he said, "we received the digital packet from your firm and the corroborating evidence from the Margaret Ashford estate attorneys." He turned to the table. He looked at Gregory and Chase. "Gregory Ashford, Chase Miller, we have warrants for your arrest on charges of securities fraud, embezzlement, and grand larceny." The officer turned to Lila. "Lila Ashford Miller, we have a warrant for your arrest regarding wire fraud and misuse of corporate assets." The room erupted into chaos, but it was a muffled, pathetic kind of chaos. Lila started screaming that she didn't do anything. Chase was trying to hide behind his chair. Gregory just sat there, staring at the business card I had slid across the table. I stood up. I picked up my briefcase. "The viewing is over," I said quietly. I walked toward the door, leaving the wreckage of the Ashford family in the hands of the state. They were finally getting the attention they had always craved. They were finally going to be the talk of the town. The air in the VIP room did not just feel heavy, it felt solidified, like we were all encased in a block of rapidly cooling concrete. The arrival of the 2 agents from the Connecticut Department of Financial Regulation had turned a family crisis into a federal crime scene. The lead investigator, a man named Agent Miller, who looked like he hadn't smiled since 1998, didn't waste time with pleasantries. He placed a heavy briefcase on the table, right next to mine. "As of 20 minutes ago," Agent Miller announced, his voice devoid of any theatrical flair, "all assets connected to the Alpha Fund, the Ashford Harbor operational accounts, and the personal liquid assets of the named directors have been frozen. We have secured a judicial order." He looked around the table, meeting the eyes of each family member. "We are also seizing all physical and digital records. Based on the preliminary evidence provided by Northbridge Advisory and the estate of Margaret Ashford, we are opening a formal criminal inquiry into Gregory Ashford and Chase Miller for securities fraud, grand larceny, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud." The word conspiracy seemed to snap something inside Chase, my brother-in-law, the man who liked to brag about his golf handicap and his imported cigars. Suddenly looked like a child who had lost his mother in a supermarket. He scrambled up from his chair, his hands shaking violently. "Wait, hold on," Chase stammered, his eyes darting wildly from the agent to Gregory. "Conspiracy? No, look, I just work there. I am the son-in-law. I just signed where Gregory told me to sign. I thought it was a legitimate financial product. I didn't know anything about where the money was coming from." He pointed a trembling finger at Gregory. "He told me it was standard leverage. He said the lawyers approved it. I am a victim here too." Agent Miller didn't blink. He reached into his file and pulled out a small digital recorder. He pressed play. The sound was tinny but unmistakable. It was Chase's voice, recorded in the locker room of the Harbor Point Country Club. "I tell you, man, these employees are sheep. They hand over their pension checks, thanking us for the opportunity, and I use it to cover the lease on the Porsche. It is like taking candy from a baby. Except the baby thanks you for taking it. Stupid money is the best money." Agent Miller stopped the recording. "That was you. 3 weeks ago," Miller said calmly, "discussing the Alpha Fund with a cooperating witness. Stupid money. That establishes knowledge and intent. Mr. Miller, you didn't just sign. You bragged about the theft." Chase collapsed back into his chair, putting his head on the table, sobbing dry. Terrified heaves. Lila looked at her husband with a mixture of disgust and horror, inching her chair away as if his criminality were contagious. Veronica was next. She smoothed the front of her dress, composing her face into a mask of bewildered innocence. It was a performance I had seen her give 100 times to get out of speeding tickets or restaurant bills. "Officer," she said, her voice trembling with practiced fragility, Surely there is a mistake regarding my name. I am just a wife. I support my husband, of course, but I have no head for business. I sign what Gregory puts in front of me because I trust him. I had no idea about any irregularities. I am just a homemaker. She looked at me, her eyes pleading. Sydney, you know that. You know I don't understand these charts. I didn't say a word. I just reached into my own stack of files. I pulled out a series of documents clipped together with a photograph. I slid them across the polished wood until they rested under Veronica's nose. This is the authorization for the sale of 40% of the Class B preferred shares, I said. The shares that were supposed to fund the employee healthcare plan. I pointed to the photo attached to the document. It was a still frame from the security camera in Gregory's office. It showed Veronica sitting at the desk, pen in hand, a glass of champagne next to her. She was laughing, her head thrown back in delight. And this, I continued, is the email you sent from your iPad 5 minutes later. Subject line, Milan trip. The body of the email reads, Gregory says the sale went through, so book the suite at the Bulgari Hotel. We can finally afford the new season wardrobe. Who cares about the dental plan? I looked at my mother-in-law. You knew exactly where the money came from, Veronica. You didn't care about the math. You only cared that the check cleared so you could go shopping. Ignorance is not a defense when you leave a paper trail of greed. Veronica's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The homemaker mask crumbled, revealing the panicked accomplice beneath. Nolan, who had been silent until now, suddenly leaned forward. He reached across the table, trying to grab my hand. I pulled back sharply. Sydney, he pleaded, his voice cracking. Please, this is too much. Look at them. They are destroyed. Can't we just stop? For the sake of the family? Just keep a little dignity? We can work this out without the police taking them away in cuffs right now. Please, think about what this looks like. I stared at him. I stared at the man I had shared a bed with. The man I had thought was my partner. Dignity? I asked, testing the word on my tongue like it was sour milk. You want to talk about dignity, Nolan? I stood up slowly. Where was the dignity when your mother asked if my father's watch came from a cereal box? Where was the dignity when you made him sit in the kitchen during your birthday party because you said he didn't fit the vibe? Where was the dignity when you told me to put him in a home so he wouldn't embarrass us at the wedding? My voice remained low, but it vibrated with 5 years of suppressed rage. You stood there, Nolan, every single time. You watched them strip my father of his pride, and you didn't say a word. You just drank your wine and told me to calm down. You don't care about dignity. You care about appearances. And frankly, this isn't my family. My family is the man waiting in the lobby wearing a watch he earned with his sweat. Lila, sensing the walls closing in, suddenly turned on her brother. The panic had stripped away her loyalty. It is his fault too, Lila screamed, pointing a manicured finger at Nolan. Don't look at me like that. Nolan knew. He told me. He told me that once the new will was read and the assets were secured, he was going to file for divorce anyway. Nolan's face drained of blood. He looked at Lila, betrayed. Lila, shut up. No, she yelled, turning to the investigator. He said Sydney was just a placeholder. He said he was tired of her boring, middle-class attitude, and that once the inheritance was locked in, he was going to cut her loose and pay her off. They were planning to get rid of her next month. I looked at Nolan. He couldn't meet my eyes. The revelation didn't hurt. It clarified things. It was the final puzzle piece. They hadn't just used me for my silence. They had planned to discard me the moment I wasn't useful. I wasn't a wife. I was a temporary, necessary evil. Gregory slammed his fist on the table, trying to regain control of a room that had long since spun out of his orbit. Enough, he roared. After everything we did for you, we pulled you out of the gutter. Sydney, we gave you a name. We gave you a lifestyle you could never dream of. You owe us. You owe us your loyalty. I owe you nothing, I replied, my voice ice cold. You didn't pull me out of the gutter. Gregory, you just dragged me into your sewer. I looked at Agent Miller. Agent Miller, I said, as the majority shareholder of Ashford Harbor Holdings and the executor of the estate's new direction, I assume you need my statement regarding the board's position on these individuals? We do, Miller said, taking out a notepad. Technically, they are still officers of the company until the board removes them. Their access to the building and the servers depends on you. Veronica let out a sob. Sydney, please, we can negotiate. We can handle this internally. We can pay it back over time. Don't let them take us away. We are family. Internal negotiation, I said, shaking my head. That is just a fancy word for silence. It means the victims wait while you figure out how to hide the money better. It means my father continues to be the punchline while you live in a house bought with stolen pension funds. I looked at the investigator. I want them removed, I said clearly. I want them escorted off the premises immediately. I want their access cards deactivated. I want a forensic audit of every dime they have spent in the last 10 years, and I will fully cooperate with the prosecution. The room exploded. It wasn't a physical fight. These people didn't fight with their fists. They were too cowardly for that. It was a cannibalization of alliances. You stupid girl, Gregory shouted at Lila. If you hadn't spent $50,000 on handbags, the audit flags wouldn't have triggered so early. Me? Lila shrieked back. Chase lost $2 million in that crypto scam last year. Why aren't you yelling at him? I only did it because Gregory said we needed quick liquidity, Chase yelled, hiding behind his lawyer. He told me to take the risk. You are all incompetent, Veronica wailed. I told you to be careful. I told you Sydney was too quiet. I told you she was watching. You told us to treat her like the help, Nolan shouted at his mother. If you hadn't been so cruel to her father, maybe she wouldn't have gone digging. This is your fault. Mother, your ego killed us. They were tearing each other apart. Accusations flew across the table like shrapnel. They were revealing secrets, admitting to smaller crimes to avoid the bigger ones, blaming each other for the moral rot that they all shared. I sat there perfectly still. I felt like a scientist observing a colony of bacteria under a microscope, watching them consume one another now that the nutrient source was gone. It was ugly, it was pathetic, and it was exactly what they deserved. I reached into my bag. The noise in the room was deafening. Sobs, shouts, legal warnings, but I tuned it out. I pulled out the velvet pouch I had taken from the podium. I removed the Veracity prototype, Margaret's watch, the one worth millions. Then, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my father's watch, the one I had borrowed from him just before entering the room, the scratched, dented, flea market watch that they had mocked for years. I placed them side by side in the center of the walnut table. The noise died down. One by one, they stopped screaming. Their eyes were drawn to the center of the table. 2 watches. One was a masterpiece of history, worth a fortune. The other was a piece of junk, worth nothing in dollars. But lying there, side by side, they looked like twins. They ticked in unison. The second hands moved together, sweeping past the numbers in perfect rhythm. Look at them, I said softly. They looked, Gregory, Veronica, Nolan, Lila, Chase. They stared at the 2 objects that had brought down their empire. You thought one was a treasure and the other was trash, I said. But they are the same. They are both about keeping time. They are both about keeping promises. I stood up and buttoned my blazer. Actually, I corrected myself, looking at the wreckage of the family before me. The cheap one is worth more, because the man who wears it never had to steal to keep it running. I nodded to Agent Miller. They are all yours. The silence in the room was absolute. The 2 watches lay on the polished walnut table, like a pair of mismatched eyes staring up at the ceiling. One was a masterpiece of horology, gleaming and pristine. The other was scarred, dull, and worn. I stood over them, looking down at the Ashford family. They were huddled in their chairs, the fight drained out of them by the presence of the federal agents and the mountain of evidence I had just dumped in front of them. You never asked, I said, my voice low and devoid of emotion. In 5 years, Not one of you ever asked about the history of these watches. You just assumed one was an asset and the other was an embarrassment. I picked up the scratched watch, my father's watch. 70 years ago, I began, turning to address the room like I was presenting a closing argument. This company was not an empire. It was a struggling shipping yard on the verge of collapse. Margaret Ashford was a young widow trying to save a failing business. She didn't have capital. She couldn't pay her workers. Gregory looked up, his eyes bloodshot. He knew the business history, or thought he did, but this chapter had been conveniently omitted from the brochures. The workers were going to walk, I continued. They were going to strike, which would have killed the company, but one man stopped them. He was the foreman. He told the men that if they walked, the town died. He convinced them to work for 3 months without pay, on nothing but a promise that they would be taken care of when the ships came in. I pointed to my father's watch. That man was Thomas Dunn, my grandfather, and when the company was saved, Margaret offered him a check, a bonus. It was enough to buy a house. I paused, letting the weight of the story settle. He turned it down. He told her that a check gets spent, but a partnership lasts. He wanted security for his men. So they made a deal, a secret operating agreement. Margaret kept the majority control, but she granted the Dunn family a silent equity stake, protected by a specific clause. I picked up the second watch, the pristine prototype. She commissioned these 2 watches, one for the owner, one for the worker. They were twin mechanisms, and the contract stated that as long as the Ashford family respected the dignity of the labor that built them, the Dunn equity would remain dormant. But if that bond was broken, if the capital ever turned on the labor with malice or public humiliation, the dormant equity would activate to protect the integrity of the company. I looked directly at Veronica. She was pale, her hands gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles were white. "You triggered it," I said to her. "It wasn't a corporate raid. It wasn't a hostile takeover. It was you, Veronica. When you sat in that auction hall and made jokes about the smell of gasoline, when you called my father's watch trash, when you laughed." Veronica flinched as if I had slapped her. "You proved that the Ashford family no longer respected the foundation of its own wealth," I said. "Margaret wrote the codicil to define malice exactly as you performed it. Your snobbery didn't just hurt my feelings. It breached a 70-year-old contract. You literally laughed your way out of your own inheritance." Veronica let out a low moan, burying her face in her hands. The realization was crushing her. She wasn't just a victim of circumstances. She was the architect of her own poverty. "So here is where we stand," I said, dropping the legal tone and switching to the cold, hard cadence of a negotiator. I looked at Gregory. "You are facing federal charges. The evidence in that briefcase will put you and Chase in prison for 10 to 15 years. The assets are frozen. The reputation of the firm is radioactive. If I walk out of this room and let the process run its course, the company goes into Chapter 7 bankruptcy, the assets get sold for scraps, the employees lose their jobs, and you all go to jail with nothing." Gregory looked at me, desperation flickering in his eyes. Is there another option?" he croaked. "There is," I said, "but you aren't going to like it." I placed my hands flat on the table. "I exercise my rights as the majority shareholder to execute an immediate restructuring. I will propose a settlement to the Department of Financial Regulation. We will create a restitution fund for the victims of your Ponzi scheme. We will liquidate the non-essential assets, the yachts, the villas, the art, to pay back the employees you stole from." I leaned forward. "In exchange, I will ask the prosecutors to consider your cooperation as a mitigating factor. It might keep your prison sentences short. It might even get you house arrest if you are lucky. But here is the price." I held up one finger. "1, Gregory, you resign immediately. You surrender your board seat. You are banned from ever holding an executive position in this company again." I held up a second finger. 2, Veronica and Lila, you are removed from the board of directors. You lose your stipends. You lose your expense accounts. You lose the company cars. You are private citizens with zero access to the corporate treasury. I held up a third finger. 3. The restitution fund needs capital. I am seizing the Ashford Family Trust, all of it, the Hamptons house, the private jet shares, the jewelry collection. It all goes into the pot to pay back the forklift drivers and the secretaries you robbed. Gregory looked like he was having a stroke. You are leaving us with nothing? We will be destitute. No, I said calmly. I am leaving you with exactly what my father had, a chance to work. I looked at the group of them. The company will survive. Under my leadership, we will rebuild. And if any of you want to eat, if you want to keep a roof over your heads, you are welcome to apply for a job. But let me be crystal clear. If you ever step foot in the Dun & Harbor offices again, you do not walk in as owners. You do not walk in as royalty. You enter as employees. You clock in. You do the work. You clock out. That is the only status you have left. The room was silent. The humiliation was total. They were being stripped of their identity, forced to become the very thing they had mocked. Workers. Nolan stood up slowly. He looked broken. He looked at his parents, then at the agents, and finally at me. Sydney, he whispered, what about us? He reached for his left hand, touching his wedding band. I know things are bad. I know I made mistakes. But we are married. Doesn't that count for something? Can't we separate the business from the marriage? I can change. Sydney, I can be the man you want. I looked at him. I looked at the man who had sat next to me at 100 dinners and never once defended me. I looked at the man who had deleted emails to protect a lie. I reached for my own left hand. I slid the diamond ring off my finger. It was a beautiful ring, a heavy ring. It clattered loudly as I dropped it onto the wooden table. You saw them humiliate my father, I said, my voice steady. You saw your mother treat him like a dog. You saw your sister laugh at him, and you said nothing. You told me to stop being sensitive. You told me to keep the peace. I looked him in the eye. I can forgive bad business. Nolan, I can even forgive stupidity. But I cannot forgive silence. A man who stands by and watches his wife's family be degraded because it is convenient for him isn't a husband. He is just a coward with a ring. Nolan flinched. Tears welled up in his eyes. But I felt nothing. The love I had for him had evaporated, burned away by the heat of his indifference. I don't share a home with a coward, I said. You should probably call a divorce lawyer. You are going to need one. Gregory let out a ragged breath. He looked up at me, his face a mask of ruin. Sydney, he asked, his voice shaking, did you ever actually care about us? Did you ever see us as family? Or was this all just a long con to you? I paused. I thought about the first time I met them. I thought about how desperate I had been to please them, to fit in, to be loved. I wanted to be family, Gregory, I said softly. I tried so hard. I learned your rules. I wore your clothes. I swallowed your insults. I picked up my father's watch again and strapped it onto my own wrist. It felt heavy and warm. But then I realized something. Family protects you. Family stands up for you. Family doesn't make you hide who you are. I looked him dead in the eye. Family is the place where no one asks my father to hide his watch because they are ashamed of him. You aren't my family. You never were. You were just people I knew who loved money more than they loved people. I turned away from them. I couldn't look at them anymore. They were ghosts. I walked over to Mr. Caldwell, who had been standing quietly in the corner, witnessing the execution of the estate. Mr. Caldwell, I said. Ms. Dunn, he replied, dipping his head respectfully. I need you to organize an event, I said. A public event. In 2 weeks. Another auction? He asked. No, I said. A rebranding. I want you to invite the press, invite the shareholders, invite the entire town of Harbor Point. I looked back at the Ashfords one last time. We are going to announce the new name of the company, and we are going to auction off the Ashford legacy, the portraits, the statues, the nameplates, everything that has their name on it. We are going to sell it all and put every penny into the restitution fund. Caldwell smiled. It was a small, sharp smile. "And what will the new company be called?" he asked. I touched the watch on my wrist. I thought about the man waiting in the lobby. "You will see," I said. "Just make sure the invitations are sent. The Ashfords have told their story for 100 years. They are done talking. I am holding the pen now." I picked up my briefcase. I signaled to the agents that they could proceed with the removal. "Get them out of my building," I said. And for the first time in 5 years, I walked out of a room feeling lighter than when I walked in. 2 weeks had passed since the doors of the private viewing room clicked shut on the Ashford dynasty. The location for tonight was different. We were not in the velvet-lined silence of the auction house. We were in the Harbor Point Community Hall, a building with scuffed linoleum floors and the smell of stale coffee and damp coats. It was packed. There were no velvet ropes tonight. The room was filled with dock workers in high-visibility jackets, administrative assistants holding crumpled tissues, local business owners, and a swarm of reporters whose cameras flashed incessantly. They were here because I had promised them the one thing the Ashfords had never given them: the truth. I stood at the center of the stage. Behind me, a massive projector screen displayed the old company logo, Ashford Harbor Holdings. The gold letters looked heavy, oppressive, a symbol of a time when profit mattered more than people. "For 3 decades," I said into the microphone, my voice echoing off the metal rafters, "this name represented a closed door. It represented a family that believed the town worked for them, rather than with them." I looked out at the crowd. I saw faces I recognized from the payroll files I had audited. Men and women who had lost their pensions to Gregory's Ponzi scheme. People who had been denied raises while Lila bought handbags in Paris. "But we are not here to dwell on the theft," I continued. "We are here to announce the restitution." I pressed the clicker in my hand. On the screen behind me, the gold letters of Ashford Harbor Holdings dissolved. In their place, a new logo appeared. It was stark, strong, and industrial. It featured the stylized outline of a gear interlocking with an anchor. And the name? Dunn and Harbor Works. A gasp rippled through the front rows. Then, a murmur of confusion mixed with awe. The name Ashford was gone. It had been scrubbed from the masthead. In its place was the name of the family they had spent 50 years trying to hide. I stepped to the side of the podium, so the new name hovered over my shoulder. "Effective immediately," I announced. "The holding company is dissolved. We are returning to our roots as an operational firm, and as the majority shareholder, my first act was to liquidate the personal assets of the former board members to seed the employee compensation fund." I gestured to the side of the stage. "The proceeds from the sale of the Ashford estate in the Hamptons, the private yacht, and the luxury vehicle fleet have already been deposited. Every dollar stolen from the pension fund will be returned, with interest, by the end of the fiscal quarter." Applause broke out. It started scattered, hesitant, and then swelled into a roar. It was the sound of relief. It was the sound of people realizing they wouldn't lose their homes. In the shadows of the wings, off to the far left of the stage, stood 4 figures: Gregory, Veronica, Lila, and Nolan. They were not in handcuffs. Their arraignment was scheduled for next week, but they looked like prisoners already. Gregory was wearing a suit that was visibly too large for him, likely an old one he hadn't worn in years. Veronica wore a simple beige coat, devoid of jewelry. Lila kept her head down, refusing to look at the audience, her hands twisting nervously. Nolan stood with his hands in his pockets, staring at the floor. They were free to leave, but they couldn't. They had nowhere to go. Their assets were frozen, their credit cards declined, and their reputation destroyed. They had to stand there and watch the world they thought they owned spin on without them. I heard a whisper from the front row, loud enough to cut through the applause. "Look," a woman whispered, pointing at them. "That is them. That is the family that laughed at the mechanic." "They look smaller in person, don't they?" a man replied. I raised my hand to quiet the room. "This company," I said, "was built on a partnership that was erased from the history books. We are correcting that tonight." I turned to the stairs on the right side of the stage. Please welcome the silent co-founder of this enterprise, the man who saved the original factory from fire in 1985, and who accepted equity instead of cash so that his co-workers could keep their jobs. My father, Mr. Earl Dunn. My father walked up the stairs. He was wearing a new suit, navy blue, fitted, dignified, but he walked with the same humble shuffle he always had. He looked terrified of the lights, blinking rapidly. When he reached the center of the stage, the room did not just applaud. They stood up. The dock workers, the mechanics, the people who knew what it meant to have grease under your fingernails. They rose to their feet. It was a standing ovation for a man who had spent his life being invisible. Dad looked at me, his eyes wide and wet. I took his hand and squeezed it. "You deserve this," I whispered. Mr. Caldwell stepped forward then. He was dressed in his signature tuxedo, the only relic of the old world that I had allowed to remain. He carried a small display case. He placed it on the podium. Inside were the two watches, the Veracity prototype and my father's scratched timepiece. Caldwell adjusted the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," Caldwell said, his voice rich and commanding, "history is often written by the people who sign the checks, but the true value of a company is found in the people who do the work. These two watches represent that balance." He pointed to the pristine watch. "This was capital," he said. He pointed to the scratched watch. "This was labor." He paused, looking out at the reporters. For 40 years, the capital mocked the labor. They forgot that without the mechanic, the machine stops. Today, under the banner of Dunn and Harbor Works, that balance is restored. These watches will no longer be separated. They will be displayed in the lobby of the new headquarters, side by side, as a reminder that no one in this company is above the person standing next to them. I took the microphone back. "We are also launching the Margaret Ashford Scholarship," I announced. "Funded by a fixed percentage of our annual operating profit, this fund will provide full college tuition for the children of our employees. It is a path forward for the next generation, so that no child in Harbor Point ever has to feel less than because of their parents' job." I saw Veronica flinch in the shadows. She was weeping silently. I knew she wasn't crying for the students. She was crying because she realized that her name, Ashford, was no longer the most powerful currency in the room. She was watching her legacy be rewritten by the people she had called the help. "We have one final item of business," I said. "A final auction." Two workers brought out a heavy object covered in a velvet cloth. They placed it on the table. "This is not a watch," I said. "This is the past." I pulled the cloth away. It was a bronze bust of Margaret Ashford. It had sat in the boardroom for 20 years, watching her son destroy her company. "We are selling this statue," I declared. "Not to erase her memory, but to purify it. The proceeds from this sale will be the first deposit into the scholarship fund." Margaret Ashford believed in work. It is only fitting that her image pays for the education of the workers' children. Caldwell raised his gavel. "Do I hear an opening bid?" The bidding was fierce. It wasn't the Ashfords bidding. They didn't have a dime. It was the town. It was the local business owners, the union leaders. They were bidding to reclaim the town's history. "Sold!" Caldwell shouted. "For $75,000 to the Harbor Point Union Local." The gavel banged. Crack! It was the sound of a final judgment. The ceremony ended. The lights on the stage dimmed slightly, focusing a spotlight on me and my father. I turned to the display case. I opened it. I took out the Veracity prototype, the watch that was worth millions, the watch that had been the crown jewel of the Ashford estate. I took my father's hand. I unclasped the strap of the expensive watch. "Give me your wrist, Dad," I said. He held out his arm. His old, scratched watch was still there, ticking steadily. I strapped Margaret's watch onto his wrist, right next to his own. The cold metal of the prototype touched the warm, dented steel of his faithful timepiece. They looked perfect together, two halves of a broken promise, finally healed. "From now on," I said, my voice thick with emotion. These are both yours. You earned the first one with your sweat. You earned the second one with your dignity. Dad looked at the two watches. He ran his thumb over the glass of the prototype, then looked at me. "Thank you, Sydney," he whispered. "Let's go home." "Yes," I said. "Let's go home." Caldwell struck the sounding block one last time, a final, resonant note that signaled the end of the proceedings. On the massive screen behind us, the camera zoomed in on my father's wrist. The image was colossal. Two watches, side by side, their second hands sweeping in perfect synchronization. It was an image of justice. I took my father's arm. We turned our backs to the audience, to the cameras, and to the Ashfords. We walked toward the exit at the back of the stage. We walked with our backs straight, our heads high. We passed the shadows where Gregory, Veronica, Lila, and Nolan stood. I didn't stop. I didn't look at them. I didn't need to see the regret on Nolan's face or the bitterness on Veronica's. They were part of the scenery now, fading into the background as the lights went out. We stepped out of the hall and into the cool night air of the harbor. The wind smelled of salt and the sea. It smelled clean. The story was over. The revenge was complete. And for the first time in my life, time was finally on our side. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to hear where you are tuning in from. So please drop a comment below and share your thoughts on the ending. Don't forget to subscribe to the Lila Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and smash that hype button so we can share more stories like this with the world.